Hello. Today we will be talking about the Renaissance. And if you're wondering where I am in a weird motel room visiting my family out of town. So the couch is kind of cute though. Anyway, so we're coming out of the dark and middle ages and we're going into the Renaissance. And the Renaissance, I'm probably gonna repeat some of this, is a time of enlightenment. I think it means enlightenment. And it is a time when artists can be creative and Michelangelo, Leonardo da Vinci, who was an inventor and a famous painter, they're out of the Renaissance. King Henry VIII is a Renaissance king. I actually was surprised about that. I didn't realize that until I did a paper about King Henry VIII and how he and the King of France, I think his name was Charles the Second. Don't quote me on that, but like they threw like a bitchin' party because I guess they were not friends at the time, and like it had fountains of wine, and they were trying to outdo each other because then like England wasn't as cool as the England today, and so King Henry VIII was trying to prove himself, and like it was just the Renaissance was a very lavish time. So we're coming out from, again, the Dark Ages and all of that, where there's the bubonic plague, which, if you don't know, like wiped out 1/3 of Europe. It was because of rats carrying diseases on ships, and so it traveled. And it like Ring Around the Rosie, actually, that little nursery rhyme that maybe you heard when you were a kid is about the bubonic plague. And so anyway, really gross time. And then we come into a really nice time where like we have a golden age of like art. The Renaissance begins. The Renaissance is from 1350 to 1650. It focused on humankind, ancient wisdom, and life in the present, which in the Dark Ages, as we discussed, it was completely the opposite. They believed in the Vale of Tears, which meant that the life we live on Earth is just a life that we're setting up for a life in heaven. And so that like nothing, it's okay to like have a shitty life on Earth because eventually you'll be saved and it'll be good. So that is definitely the opposite. What else did I say? It focused on humankind and ancient wisdom. So the church in the Dark Ages had thrown away all of those ancient texts and they're like, no, this is not what we want to do. So this is like, it's the complete opposite of what we just talked about last chapter. People stepped away from the lives they spent in preparation for Judgment Day, like the Dark Ages, and into a life of secular reason, intellectual curiosity, and creativity. This was a time of rebellion and rebirth. In fact, Renaissance means rebirth. Okay, so rebirth, not enlightenment. One really big thing that happened in the Renaissance is the printing press. And I mentioned this again in last chapter that it was $1,700 in today's standards for a book. And so with the printing press, not only could people get books more readily available, so you can have like libraries of it, or like maybe even a common person, if they knew how to read, they could get a book, but it also meant that people could print out like newsletters and like people can get news and it could travel more fasting. So I guess if you think about it, it's kind of like, this is going to sound lame, like texting today or like Twitter. It was like the Twitter of their day in a way, because like the news could actually travel instead of getting all of your information from like a certain source or like a person like the church. Now you can get different type of news outlets. So Johann Gutenberg invented the printing press. The printing press was the beginning of mass media. Exactly. Like Twitter. Kind of, not really. By 1515, all known works of ancient Greek authors had been translated and printed, which is a really big deal. And it's not all works, because a lot of them, as I mentioned, there were people who burned down cities and libraries and things. So like again, the works that we did somehow have were saved and then printed, which is how they exist today, because they were actually written down and then like produced more and more, so we have copies. And then a little side note, I guess, the reason why we talk a lot about history in theater history is because all of history kind of like plays off of each other. And so it's important to know what was happening in the world and how it affected the arts. And the arts especially, we try to be fresh and new, and we like try to think about what's going on and make socially conscious decisions and think about what needs to be said and all of that. And so the world affects art always. And art is a response sometimes to the world around you. So we'll see history play into theater again and again in these chapters. Actually, we only have like 4 more, but yes, history is important. The demise of religious theater. A monk named Martin Luther named a list of 95 complaints on the door of the All Saints Church at Wittenberg. These are actually also known as the 95 Theses. His actions have gone down in history as an isolated act of defiance. But within a 3-month period, printing presses in Germany were rolling out printed copies of his complaints and passing them out. Sorry for all the typos. This sparked other factions in the church to rise up, and slowly the power of the Catholic Church was crumbling. And fun fact, I don't know if you know this, Martin Luther, the Lutheran sect of Christianity, was founded because he broke away from the Catholic Church, and he didn't start, but like because of this, that's why Lutheranism is a branch of Christianity, because of Martin Luther. And then also because of the printing press, people were able to get like his theses and see what was actually going on and form an opinion for themselves. Because again, before this, people were very illiterate and they didn't have a lot of options to figure out what was the truth. And like honestly, in the Dark Ages, we didn't talk about this, but they did things where and this is one of the things that Martin Luther was against, they would do things where you would have to pay to be forgiven for your sins. And so that's how they took money from the poor, because the poor couldn't read the Bible. I don't know if they would amend what the Bible said or if they would just pick and choose like some of the verses that they read to the people, but the people thought they were pieces of shit, and so they would like pay for their sins to repent to God and get forgiveness, which is not how you should do it. The church today is like, you can just be forgiven. I mean, Catholic Church, you say Hail Marys or Our Fathers. I think it's Hail Marys. I don't remember. It's been a while since Catholic school. But yeah, so that was something corrupt that Martin Luther was like, you can't do this to people. But the people didn't know any better because they were just getting their information from the one source. The Italian influence. Most scholars agree that the Renaissance started in 14th century Italy. The rebirth of slapstick. Traveling theater companies searched for crossroads, squares, and fairs where they could set up makeshift platforms and attract the audience. The most successful theater form was Commedia dell'arte. This comedy form focuses on farce and horseplay. A slapstick is a device made of 2 pieces of wood hinged together that slap. When a slapstick is applied to an actor's behind, it would make a loud crack, and that would be hilarious.
To play the slapstick, you're going to hold it in your dominant hand or your striking hand, and you're going to use a motion that's really similar to striking a drum with a mallet, for example. So just hold the slapstick here and strike downward, and then you're going to stop the motion, and it's going to bring those pieces of wood together.
Commedia dell'arte. Common subjects of the shows included slaves tricking their masters, misunderstandings between lovers, peasants who are smarter than aristocrats. There were no scripts, so the players improvised on basic scenarios, and no 2 performances were exactly the same. During performances, actors would improvise scenes based on suggestions from the audience. It's like a whose line is there anyway, but before. A company of commedia actors numbered from 5 to 25, and many included a few women. So now we're getting into the time where women actually played their women characters. So when we get into it, there's a couple that's always in Commedia dell'arte. They're the young lovers, and the woman in the couple would actually be a lady. That's exciting. Characters of Commedia dell'arte. Each actor specializes in playing one particular stock character based on a common stereotype. The characters could be distinguished not only by their roles, but also their costumes and their masks. And here is some of the mask examples that we have. Characters. We have Arlecchino, or Harlequin, who is a servant of Pantalone, a stingy, retired Venetian merchant who often makes a fool of himself by courting young girls. And then there's a picture of Harlequin. They're always kind of in like a Harlequin clown costume, which actually maybe the name Harley Quinn came from Harlequin. Makes sense, right? And then this is a picture of Pantalone, who he's always in his like jammies, and there's usually a butt flap for him. So sometimes there's like his butt's exposed, and it's hilarious. And he's always an old crotchety man, and they always wear the same masks. We have Scapino, a servant and acrobat who is smarter than his master. Innamorata, or innamorato, a leading lady and leading man who are lovers. They are the only characters who don't wear masks, I believe. And then La Rufina, a gossipy old woman who meddles in the affairs of the lovers. And then I will attach a crash course history because Mike Renetta is amazing, and I do like large brush strokes on my lectures, and he really gets in there. And both of them will be quiz materials because I love crash course. It didn't exist until 2 years ago, and I wish it existed all my life. Fun fact, if you ever have other classes, he has crash course like literature. PBS does a lot of stuff. They have crash course, history, myths. I'm a nerd, but they're fun to watch. So we don't get too much into art of this time, but again, you know that Leonardo da Vinci and Michelangelo were in this time. But there's Italian perspective scenery came in from this time too. The Italians gave the theater perspective scenery. Filippo Brunelleschi was the first important architect of Italian Renaissance and is credited with inventing this type of painting. This type of painting relies on converging lines and a vanishing point to create the illusion of 3D on a flat 2D surface. And here's an example of that. And if you've ever taken art classes, you know that you draw a little dot and everything's line needs to connect to that dot to then get you that kind of dimension in it. And so before this, think about it, if they had painted flats, it'd be like, here's like a little bush in the front and there's like nothing in the back, like the mountain's on the same plane as it, so everything looks very much like a cartoon picture. And so this is beautiful, and it comes in a lot in Romanticism, which we'll talk about in 2 chapters from now. So next we get into Queen Elizabeth I. We have the Queen Elizabeth II is the one reigning right now in England, but Queen Elizabeth I is she was a huge patron of theater, and she was actually the one who really supported Shakespeare in his career, and she got him to write plays for her, and like she would come to his performances, and she loved Shakespeare. And she, just so you know, I don't know how many of you know history of King Henry VIII or the Tudors, but she is King Henry VIII's second child, and from his second wife, Anne Boleyn, who's the one who got her, well, 3 of them get their heads chopped off. And just for you, so you know, Catherine of Aragon was his first wife, and she gave birth to Bloody Mary. You know all those urban legends, like don't look in the mirror and say Bloody Mary 3 times? That was his first daughter. And the reason why she's called Bloody Mary is not because of, I don't know, she didn't love killing people maybe, but Catherine of Aragon was the niece of the King of Spain, and so if King Henry VIII murdered her for saying she did treason, there would be a war against him, and he was like, no, I can't do that, and she was Catholic, and so what he did is he created his own church. He separated from the church and that's where Protestants come from. He created the Church of England, which is a Protestant sect of Christianity, and so he divorced her because it was okay in his religion, even though it was not okay in Catholic religion. So she went back to Spain, and his daughter was raised super Catholic. And then, so then Bloody Mary became Bloody Mary because she came to rule after his first son Edward died, and she came into this whole like Protestant, like King Henry VIII made everybody become Protestant from being a Catholic and join his Church of England. And then she rolls around and she's like, everybody needs to be Catholic again. And they were like, well, and then she's like, you're dead to me. And so they have like a garden in the Tower of London, which is where she beheaded all these people, and then that became the Bloody Tower. I think it's called the Bloody Tower now. I don't remember. But that's where she murdered everybody in her court who defied her. And then she only ruled for 5 years. And then it was Queen Elizabeth I. Then he married Anne Boleyn, and she had a daughter, Queen Elizabeth I. And then she also had a stillborn son. And then after that, he was like, I'm done with you, and like cut off her head. And then he married Jane Seymour, who was his third wife, and she died in childbirth but gave him a son, Edward. But he was really sickly, and when he did get the throne, he only ruled for 5 years and then died. And then after that, he married a Catherine, who I think he killed that one. And then he married another Catherine. Nope. And then he married another. Shit. He married somebody else who he really liked her, and he was like, you know what, I'm just going to ship you off to the country and you just live a good life. And then the last wife outlived him, so he only killed 2 wives. Anyway, so yeah, Queen Elizabeth, or Elizabethan theater. When Elizabeth I became queen in 1558, there was not a lot of professional theater in London. By her death in 1603, London had been transformed into one of the theater capitals of the world. By the late 1500s, every Londoner was within 2 miles of a theater of some kind. That sounds like San Francisco. The World of the Globe, and the Globe is the name of the theater that Shakespeare had. Performances would start around 2 p.m. The theater sat 2,800 people. Plays performed were fast-paced and aimed to please. Scenery was minimal. Costumes were often extravagant affairs of gold, lace, silk, and velvet donated by aristocratic patrons. There was no attempt to make costumes historically accurate. Actors performing in Shakespeare's Julius Caesar wore Elizabethan costumes, not togas. I feel like I've mentioned that before. Performances had music and plenty of special effects and realistic swordplay. Actors hid bladders filled with sheep's blood under their costumes so that during a fight sequence when they were stabbed, real blood would ooze out, which, by the way, I don't know how they dealt with that. That would be a costume designer's nightmare. If you tell a costume designer today, where we have laundry and bleach and like ways to get fake blood out, if you tell them you want to put blood on stage, they will like flip and argue against it so much of the time, or you need like 3 backup costumes. Or like you make the actor right when they got off stage take off the costume and go get somebody to spot treat it at that moment. Like, I don't know how they did that in Shakespeare's time, unless they had like a new shirt every night. But they also didn't perform the same play every night like we do. It'd like be in rotating. The stage was also filled with trapdoors so characters playing ghosts could mysteriously appear and disappear. Above the stage were cannons filled with blanks that could be fired to create realistic battle scenes. And actually, those cannons, the globe eventually burned down, and it was because one of those cannons like sparked off one of the blanks and the theater caught on fire. So maybe not the best idea. And then here are some pictures of what the globe looked like in renderings. And then honestly, they rebuilt it, and so this is what they've rebuilt, like an exact-ish replica of it, and so these are what those modern pictures are that you see today. And as you can see, like, this theater was in the round, which is something that, like, it's hard to do, because as we mentioned before, when theaters are this way, you have to make sure that you're not giving the audience your back the entire time. So you really, when you're blocking a scene, you need to think about how you can face the audience and how you can like include everybody. Actors had little time to learn their parts. Theaters often put on different plays every day. Actors only had hours to figure out their blocking, rehearse fight sequences, stage dance numbers, and learn their lines. Actors were not given a full script, but only their lines handwritten on a roll of paper. So then they would know their cue line and when to come in. A company of actors consisted of 8 to 15 players. Young men or boys would play the parts of women. We're going to spotlight Shakespeare a little bit more next time with some Mike Renetta, but here is some facts about him. So, William Shakespeare, the Bard. He was born 1564 to 1616. Not much is known about Shakespeare's life, but we do know that he was born in a small town of Stratford. He attended a well respected elementary school. He dropped out of school at the age of 13 or 14 to work full time with his father. At 18, he was forced to marry Anne Hathaway. She was an older lady that he got pregnant. She was years older than him, 8 years older than him, and pregnant with his baby. Oh, yep. In addition, he and Anne had two more children, twins. When he was 28, he moved to London, where he worked as an actor. At age 30, he began writing plays. He retired from writing at age 49 and returned to Stratford. He died at 52 after a night of drinking with his writer buddy. Not much else is known because he never kept a diary, wrote letters, or had a manuscript, which is interesting because at this time, everybody kept a diary or everybody wrote a manuscript about themselves. It's like, what did you have to do with your time? You could only go to the theater so much. I mean, I guess he was writing a bunch of plays, although it's rumored that he didn't write all his plays, but it's like, people kept journals. It was a very big thing until, like, I don't know, at some point in the, like, our generations. I remember I had a diary, but I always felt weird writing in it, so it's something that I think eventually went out of style. All we know are things mentioned in legal documents. It is thought he started writing in 1592 when, because of plague, the theater shut down. Many actors left the city to travel with acting companies, but Shakespeare waited the plague out at the estate of Henry, I'm going to butcher that name, so I'm not going to say it, an earl and patron of the arts. How cool would that be to have a rich friend and he'd just be like, come to my mansion. He became popular after theaters reopened because he gave the audience what they wanted. And also, a lot of people probably didn't come back to England, so that probably helped that there were less people to compete with. And he usually started his plays with an event, a jolting moment to get the audience interested. This is a tactic that many Hollywood screenwriters still use today. And what that means is, like, so taking Romeo and Juliet, for example, as always, the first scene has nothing to do with Romeo or Juliet. It's Juliet's cousin, Tybalt, and Romeo's cousin, Benvolio, and they're groups of friends, and somehow they meet each other in a square, and they have a huge sword fight that ensues, and so that's very action driven, and you're like, oh man, this is going to be a great show. Or like in the 1990 version with Leonardo DiCaprio, it was a gunfight, and then like a gas station blew up, and it's like a whole bunch of pyrotechnics, and it's like crazy. And that's actually, maybe I'll put that scene in. It's really good. But then like in Hollywood, we still do that, where maybe this beginning of the movie starts with like a chase or a fight scene, and we are just like, where's this car going? What's happening? And then we're invested in the rest of the movie because it grabs us right at the beginning instead of like a slow start. Still Shakespeare. He intensified his tragedies with comic relief and filled his plays with implied sex, overt violence, and conflict. There are tons of penis jokes, which actually was popular in the Renaissance and I guess all through theater before modern theater. But like there are definitely like penis jokes and like sex jokes in his plays. If you can find them. Hundreds of years after his death, Shakespeare is still one of the most staged playwrights. There have been over 300 movies and television shows adapted from his plays.